I never thought a quiet morning by the lake could turn into chaos, but that's exactly what happened. My grandpa, a man who had spent more than 80 years perfecting the art of patience, was out in his little wooden boat, fishing like he had every morning for as long as I could remember. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden streaks across the water, and the mist hovered above the surface like a soft blanket. Everything seemed perfect, the kind of calm that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. I sat on the shore, sipping my coffee, watching him move with the ease of someone who belonged there, who had owned that lake in spirit if not in law for decades. Little did I know, the people running our homeowners association had spotted him. And these weren't the friendly kind of neighbors who stopped by to borrow sugar or wave hello. No, these were the type of people who measured grass height in millimeters, monitored every mailbox decoration, and kept a ledger of who left their trash cans out too long. They were obsessed with rules and control, and apparently fishing was now considered a threat to their carefully curated order. I watched from the trees lining the shore, thinking this would be a minor misunderstanding. Maybe a polite warning, a short conversation, and then Grandpa could go back to casting his line. I was very wrong. The tension started subtly, almost imperceptibly. I noticed a small black SUV pull onto the gravel road at the edge of the lake, the engine ticking as it idled. My heart sank a little. There was something in the way the car stopped that told me it wasn't just a drive-by. Out stepped two men, middle-aged, wearing polo shirts tucked neatly into khaki pants, badges clipped to their belts that proclaimed their authority in that gated community. They moved with a sense of purpose, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning the water like they were about to enforce martial law. I felt a pang of dread. Grandpa had seen confrontations with these people before, once over a mailbox that was supposedly the wrong shade of white, but nothing like this. He waved at them casually, his hand steady, his face calm. "Morning," he called, his voice carrying across the water. "Beautiful day for fishing, isn't it?" The men didn't wave back. They approached the edge of the lake with the sort of seriousness usually reserved for crime scenes. I could hear one muttering under his breath about violations and community rules. Grandpa leaned back, resting his fishing rod on the side of the boat. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. If anything, there was a mischievous glint in his eye. The kind of look that warned troublemakers that they were about to be outsmarted by someone who didn't even need to move fast to be 3 steps ahead. From my vantage point, I could see my own anxiety rising. This was not going to be a normal morning. The men started gesturing at the water, pointing at my grandpa like he was some intruder in his own backyard. One of them held up a small device, probably trying to look official, and began reading aloud a list of rules that sounded increasingly ridiculous. "Fishing is prohibited without prior approval," he said. "This area is restricted to residents only." I almost laughed because Grandpa had lived here longer than most of the HOA members had been alive, and he had every right to be there. But I caught myself. This wasn't a joke. These people were serious, and in their minds, the law was on their side. Grandpa, as usual, was calm. He tilted his head slightly and replied, "I'm just here to enjoy the lake. I've been fishing here longer than anyone alive, and as far as I know, nobody ever asked me for permission." He smiled, as if to soften the statement, but there was steel underneath it. It was the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you are right, not just thinking you are. The men blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. I could see their hands tighten around the clipboards, their bodies stiffen. One of them cleared his throat, trying to regain authority. I stayed hidden behind the trees, holding my coffee like a shield, feeling my stomach twist in a mix of anticipation and dread. I had a sinking feeling that this confrontation was only going to escalate. The birds continued to chirp, completely oblivious, adding a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Grandpa adjusted his fishing line, a simple, calm movement that somehow made the tension feel even more absurd. I wanted to call out a warning, to tell him to leave, but my voice stuck somewhere between awe and disbelief. And then, as if the universe had a sense of irony, I noticed one of the men reaching for his phone. That simple movement sent a shiver down my spine. The cops. They were going to call the cops, over fishing, in a lake that Grandpa practically owned. I felt my pulse quicken. What was meant to be a peaceful morning was about to explode into something I had never anticipated. I sipped my coffee, bracing myself, because I knew that 3 minutes from now, everything would change. The moment the phone came out of the man's pocket, I knew things were about to get out of hand. He wasn't just going to lecture Grandpa about rules or regulations anymore. No, this was escalating into the kind of situation that makes small communities notorious on YouTube and Facebook. My grandpa, calm as ever, leaned back in his boat, oblivious to the storm brewing on the shore. I, on the other hand, felt my stomach knot tighter with every second. The men stepped closer to the water, their polished shoes crunching against the gravel, clipboards still clutched like shields. One of them cleared his throat, the sound sharp and authoritative, like he thought it could make up for the lack of actual legal standing. "Sir," he said, pointing at Grandpa's fishing pole, "you need to stop fishing immediately. You are in violation of community rules. We've called the authorities. They are on their way." Grandpa didn't flinch. He smiled, leaning on his rod like he had just been told a funny joke. "Oh, they're coming. Well, I suppose they'll want to see what's going on anyway," he said. "I'd be happy to explain. Maybe I can even show them the view from my boat. It's much nicer than standing on the shore, isn't it?" He chuckled softly, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. The men looked at each other nervously. It was obvious that Grandpa's calm confidence was rattling them. They had probably expected him to stammer, to apologize, maybe even to pack up and leave. Instead, he was smiling, teasing almost, while they stood there trying to maintain an air of authority. I could see the frustration growing in their eyes, the kind that makes a person's face turn red and their hands shake slightly. It was almost cinematic, the absurdity of two grown adults trying to intimidate an 80-year-old fisherman who wasn't even breaking the law. And then, as if on cue, the sound of sirens in the distance made my heart skip a beat. My palms were sweaty, and I gripped the coffee cup tighter, wishing I could teleport to the other side of the lake to warn Grandpa. But there was no need. He didn't seem worried in the slightest. He adjusted his hat, took a deep breath, and cast his line back into the calm water as if nothing had changed. The patrol car pulled up slowly, the officers stepping out with a mixture of confusion and mild amusement on their faces. One of them, a younger man with a kind expression, glanced at the lake, then back at the HOA men, clearly trying to assess what he had just been called to deal with. So what seems to be the problem?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. The HOA guy, puffing out his chest, began his speech, reciting rules and regulations as though he were giving a presentation to the United Nations. "This gentleman," he said, pointing at Grandpa, "is fishing without authorization in a restricted area. He is violating community guidelines, and we require enforcement action immediately." I couldn't help but notice the young officer raising his eyebrows, clearly questioning the urgency of the situation. He glanced at Grandpa in the boat, then back at the men, and I swear I saw a tiny smirk trying to form. Grandpa, ever the entertainer in tense moments, leaned slightly over the side of the boat and waved at the officer. "Morning," he said in the most innocent tone imaginable. "I'm just fishing. I promise I won't cause any trouble, unless someone steps on my toes, of course." The HOA men's faces went from red to white in seconds. I could almost hear the mental gears grinding, trying to figure out how this had escalated so quickly. They had called the cops thinking they would swoop in and assert control, but the cops were already looking at them like they had just called over a sandwich dispute in a war zone. I tried to focus on Grandpa, who was now casually reeling in a fish, humming to himself as if nothing at all was happening. The absurdity of it all struck me, two men with clipboards, full of authority, trying to control someone who literally owned more of the lake than they did, and the police officers just standing there, silently judging the situation. And then the young officer took a step closer to the water, squinting at the lake, and that's when I felt it, the shift. He was noticing something the HOA had completely ignored. The lake wasn't just a community pond. It had history, legal papers, and ownership that trumped every rulebook these men could carry. I leaned forward, heart pounding, knowing that in a few minutes the entire dynamic would flip and there would be no going back. Grandpa adjusted his hat, smiled, and cast his line once more. "I hope you're ready," he said quietly to me, though the HOA men probably didn't hear. "This is about to get very interesting." I swallowed hard and held my breath. I had no idea he was right, but I was about to find out in a way that would be unforgettable. The police officers had just stepped onto the gravel, and I could feel the tension in the air thicken like a storm about to break. One of the older officers, a man with a worn face and a calm demeanor, glanced at the lake, and then back at the HOA men, clearly questioning why anyone would call law enforcement over a fishing rod. The younger officer looked intrigued, leaning slightly forward, trying to see exactly what had prompted this emergency. Grandpa, as usual, remained calm. He adjusted his fishing rod, not even acknowledging the stares or the clipboards waving in his direction. "Good morning, officers," he said in his usual gentle, teasing tone. "I hear you've been called out to stop me from fishing. I hope this isn't a bad time. The fish don't mind company, though." The HOA men practically vibrated with frustration. I could see them thinking maybe if we shout louder, he'll understand he's supposed to be intimidated. One of them jabbed a finger toward Grandpa's boat. "Sir, you are violating community rules," he said, voice shaking slightly. "We demand that you stop fishing immediately. Legal action will be pursued if necessary." The young officer raised an eyebrow and glanced at his partner. "So, fishing is illegal?" he asked, his tone skeptical but polite. I tried not to laugh because that was exactly what I was thinking. It felt like we were living in some alternate universe where a fishing pole was the most dangerous weapon known to mankind. Grandpa tilted his head and smiled. "Well," he said slowly, letting the words linger in the air, "I suppose it could be if you count catching a trophy fish as a crime. Otherwise, I'm just enjoying my morning." The officers exchanged glances, and I could see the tiniest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of their mouths. They weren't going to arrest anyone for fishing. Not today, not over this. And then, as the older officer stepped closer to the shore, his eyes flicked to the water, and I noticed something in his expression change. It wasn't surprise exactly, it was recognition. He leaned down slightly, squinting at the lake, and I could see the gears turning in his head. He was noticing something the HOA had completely overlooked, something important. Grandpa, oblivious to the officer's subtle shift, began reeling in another fish. "You know," he said casually, "people have been fishing here for generations. Some even claim the lake has secrets." He gave me a quick wink, and I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I had no idea what secrets he meant, but judging by the officer's reactions, it wasn't just the fish. The HOA men, meanwhile, were losing control of the situation. One of them was waving his arms, trying to regain authority. "Officers," he said, voice rising, "you don't understand. These rules exist to protect the community. We cannot allow unauthorized fishing, trespassing, or violation of property lines. Enforcement is necessary." The young officer, now standing at the water's edge, shook his head slightly. "Sir," he said to Grandpa, "do you actually own this property?" He didn't wait for an answer, already flipping through some papers he had pulled from his patrol car. The older officer squinted at the documents. The HOA men were clearly unprepared for this. Their faces, once red with anger, now slowly drained of color. Grandpa leaned back in his boat, resting the fishing rod on his lap, and said, "Officers, I've owned this lake and the surrounding property for decades. I've got all the deeds, all the legal documentation you could need. It's all in order. I suppose someone forgot to check before calling the authorities." He chuckled softly, and for the first time that morning, I laughed out loud. The absurdity of it all was staggering. The officers looked at each other and then back at the HOA men who were sputtering in disbelief. The younger officer held up a hand, stopping them mid-sentence. "Gentlemen," he said, voice calm but firm, "it seems like your enforcement here is unnecessary. Based on these documents, this property belongs to this gentleman. I suggest you reconsider your actions before escalating further." I could feel my stomach loosen. The tide was turning and fast. The HOA men were visibly panicked now, realizing they had overstepped in a spectacular way. Grandpa adjusted his hat again, giving them a knowing look, almost as if to say, "Did you really think this would go your way?" And just when I thought the tension couldn't get any higher, the older officer looked at the lake again, narrowing his eyes. "Wait," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "This isn't just a lake, is it?" He glanced at Grandpa. "There's more here than meets the eye." I leaned forward, heart pounding, because I knew what he was noticing. The lake, the land, the rights to the water. It was all worth more than anyone around had imagined. The HOA had called the cops thinking they were enforcing rules, but in a few moments, they were about to realize that everything they thought they controlled had been under someone else's authority all along. Grandpa gave me a small nod, still holding his fishing rod, still calm, still in control. "Let's see how this unfolds," he whispered, and I knew I was about to witness something that would be talked about in this neighborhood for years. The game had shifted, and the next few minutes would change everything. As the older officer squinted at the lake, I felt my pulse quicken. There was something in his eyes that told me he had realized what the HOA had completely overlooked. For years, they had strutted around with clipboards, patrol cars, and rulebooks, thinking they controlled this little community. But now, under the calm morning sun, the truth was about to hit them like a thunderbolt. Grandpa, still in his boat, gave me a subtle nod, as if he could feel the shift in the air. He cast his line again, deliberately slow, his movements relaxed, almost lazy, like he had all the time in the world. The HOA men, however, were anything but relaxed. They were packing, whispering to each other, waving their arms and muttering about paperwork and bylaws. I watched them, trying not to laugh, because the sight of adults acting like children in the face of reality was strangely satisfying. The young officer bent down, carefully examining some documents he had pulled from the patrol car. The older officer joined him, and I could hear snippets of their conversation. "These deeds are in order," the younger one murmured. "Full ownership, including water rights, land rights, and access to the lake." His voice was calm but carried an undertone of disbelief. The older officer nodded, scanning the papers quickly, then looked back at the HOA men. "Gentlemen," he said, "it seems you've been enforcing rules on a property that does not belong to you." The HOA men froze. One of them sputtered, opening his mouth only to close it again. They had no words, no argument, no way to salvage the situation. I could see the panic rising in their eyes, the slow realization that everything they thought they controlled was slipping away. I leaned forward slightly, heart racing, because I knew the next moments were going to be incredible. Grandpa's voice cut through the tension like a knife, calm and steady. "I've owned this lake for decades," he said. "All the documents are available if anyone cares to look. You might want to double-check before calling the cops next time." He smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling with amusement. The officers glanced at each other, clearly struggling to suppress smiles, and then back at the HOA men, who were now pale and defensive. The HOA president, red-faced and flustered, tried to regain some semblance of authority. "Well, we were only trying to protect the community," he stammered. "These rules exist for a reason." The younger officer interrupted him, voice calm but firm. "Sir, the reason doesn't matter here. Property ownership does. These rules do not apply to this lake, and any enforcement action you take could be considered harassment." My grandpa chuckled softly, reeling in another small fish as if mocking their desperation. I could see the frustration boiling over. The president waved his arms like a conductor of chaos, trying to make someone believe he had control, but the police officers were now clearly in command of the situation. I felt a sense of giddy anticipation, knowing that the HOA's pride and arrogance were about to collide with reality. Then the older officer leaned closer to the water, his eyes narrowing again. I realized he had noticed something else. The lake, beyond being privately owned, was sitting atop significant land and water rights, the kind of thing that could easily be worth millions if properly leveraged. I felt my stomach drop and my heart race. The HOA had not just miscalculated, they had stepped onto a minefield without realizing it. Grandpa leaned over slightly, whispering to me just loud enough to hear. "They think this is just about fishing. Wait until they realize what's really here." I swallowed hard, barely able to contain my excitement. 3 minutes ago, the HOA thought they were enforcing rules. Now they were staring down a property and rights they didn't own, and the scale of what they had attempted was staggering. The younger officer glanced at the older one and said quietly, "This could get interesting." I grinned behind the trees, knowing exactly what he meant. The HOA men were still trying to argue, but their words were hollow, meaningless against the paper trail, ownership documents, and the calm authority of my grandpa. Grandpa adjusted his hat, cast his line once more, and smiled faintly at the officers. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose this morning was going to be memorable, but I didn't expect it to be this dramatic." I laughed quietly, realizing that the calm, quiet man in the boat had just turned a small fishing dispute into a moment of poetic justice. I leaned back, watching the tension play out like a movie. The HOA men were trapped in their own arrogance, caught between the law, property rights, and a grandpa who had outsmarted them all without ever raising his voice. The lake, once a simple place for fishing and morning peace, had become the stage for a confrontation they would never forget. And as I sipped my coffee, trying not to spill it from excitement, I knew that in the next few minutes, everything was going to change even more. The secret of the lake, its true value, and the consequences for the HOA were about to be revealed. I couldn't wait to see their faces when reality fully hit. The tension had shifted completely. The HOA men were no longer in control, and I could see it in every twitch, every panicked glance, every faltering word. They had strutted onto the shore thinking they were enforcers, the ultimate authority in this little lakeside world. Now they looked like lost children caught sneaking into someone else's candy store. My grandpa, meanwhile, was as calm as ever, leaning back in his boat and adjusting his hat as though he had all the time in the world. The HOA president, red-faced and sputtering, tried to regain some semblance of authority. "We are the Homeowners Association," he barked, pointing at the lake as if the water would magically obey him. "We enforce the rules here. You cannot just—" He stopped mid-sentence when one of the police officers held up a hand. "Sir," said the younger officer, voice calm but firm, "your rules do not apply here. Legally, this property belongs to him." He gestured toward my grandpa, who was now smiling faintly, as though he had expected this moment all along. The officer's words hung in the air like a gavel striking a courtroom, and the HOA men looked like they had been hit by a truck. Grandpa adjusted his fishing rod, casually reeling in another fish. "It's amazing what a little paperwork can do," he said softly, almost to himself, though I caught the words clearly. I laughed quietly, shaking my head. Only Grandpa could make a legal victory look like a peaceful morning fishing trip. The HOA men were panicking now. They started flipping through their own binders, waving sheets of paper, muttering about community guidelines and previous enforcement actions. It was clear that they had never actually looked at the deeds, the legal documents, or the history of the lake. They had acted on assumptions, ego, and a misplaced sense of power. And now, standing in front of officers who actually understood the law, they had nothing. I could see the younger officer taking notes, but mostly he was just observing, letting the HOA men dig their own hole. The older officer leaned against the patrol car, arms crossed, watching with quiet amusement. He had clearly seen enough small-town drama to know when to step back and let reality handle itself. Grandpa's calm was infuriating the HOA men even more. One of them jabbed a finger toward him and shouted, "You cannot just flaunt the rules." Grandpa chuckled softly. "Flaunt," he said. "I'm not flaunting anything, I'm fishing, legally, peacefully, and with full ownership of the property. I suppose your rules only apply when they don't conflict with the law, correct?" He smiled, a gentle but cutting smile that made the president's face turn even redder. I could feel my pulse quicken as I realized the gravity of the situation. The lake wasn't just a place to fish. It was privately owned, completely under Grandpa's control, and any attempt by the HOA to assert authority could now be considered harassment, or worse, a legal liability. The officers were silently acknowledging this, and the HOA men were slowly beginning to grasp the scale of their mistake. Grandpa leaned slightly over the side of the boat, tugging gently on his fishing line, and whispered to me, "Wait for it. They're about to realize how valuable this really is." I blinked, heart racing. I had no idea what he meant, but I trusted him completely. After all, this was the same man who had quietly negotiated community disputes, built businesses, and outsmarted bureaucrats half his life. The HOA president finally spluttered out, "But the community, our rules." The older officer held up a hand, cutting him off. "The community doesn't own this lake," he said firmly. "The property, water rights, and everything associated with it belong to him. Any further attempts to enforce unauthorized rules here could have serious legal consequences." The younger officer took a step closer to the water, squinting, and I noticed him glance at the surface, as if seeing something beneath it. My stomach dropped as I realized the true scope of what he was noticing. It wasn't just the ownership papers. The lake itself, the water rights, the surrounding land, it was worth a fortune. The HOA had no idea what they were dealing with. Grandpa smiled faintly, still reeling in his line, and said, You know, most people think this is just a lake. They don't realize it's a little treasure hidden in plain sight. I couldn't help but grin. The next moments were going to be incredible. The HOA men were about to learn a lesson that no amount of rule books could teach, and I had the perfect seat to watch it unfold. As I sipped my coffee, my eyes on Grandpa and the frustrated HOA, I realized that mornings like this didn't come often. Tension, humor, drama, and a little poetic justice all wrapped into one quiet lakeside morning. And I knew without a doubt that the next part of this story, the big reveal, was going to leave everyone involved completely stunned. Grandpa had been calm all morning, but now I noticed a faint twinkle in his eyes, the kind that comes before something unexpected happens. The younger officer bent slightly closer to the lake, squinting at the water and then glancing at the older officer. I could tell they were piecing together something the HOA had completely ignored. The lake, the property, the water rights, it wasn't just a community pond. It was a hidden treasure. "Wait a second," the older officer murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "This isn't just a lake, is it?" He looked at my grandpa, eyes wide with realization. I leaned forward, heart pounding, because I knew exactly what he was about to discover. This lake, calm and serene, sitting in plain sight, was worth a fortune. The HOA had been barking up the wrong tree, enforcing rules over a property they didn't even own, and now the scale of their mistake was about to hit them like a ton of bricks. Grandpa's voice cut through the tension, soft and steady. "It's amazing what people overlook when they assume authority is theirs by default," he said, still reeling in his fishing line, his movements deliberate and calm. "This lake has been in my family for generations. Not only do we own the water, but the rights beneath it, the surrounding land, it's all mine. All properly documented, of course." He gave me a subtle wink, as if to say, the show is about to begin. The HOA president's face went pale. He stammered, trying to regain control. But the community," he began, waving his arms in desperation. One of the men even pointed at his rulebook as if it could magically assert itself against the law. "Our rules, our authority." The younger officer stepped forward, cutting him off. "Sir, these rules do not apply here. This property, including the lake and surrounding rights, belongs entirely to this gentleman. Any enforcement action at this point could be considered illegal or worse, harassment." He glanced at his partner, who gave a quiet nod. The message was clear. The HOA had no power here. I could barely contain my excitement. The HOA men were panicking, shuffling their papers, muttering to each other, but nothing could fix the mess they had made. They had called the cops thinking they were asserting authority, and now their faces were frozen in disbelief. Every twitch, every gasp, every failed attempt to regain control made me grin quietly from behind the trees. Grandpa leaned slightly over the side of his boat, tugging gently on his line, and whispered to me, just loud enough for me to hear, "They think this is just about fishing. Wait until they realize what's really beneath the surface." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. I had a feeling he was about to reveal the full extent of the lake's hidden value, and I couldn't wait to see the HOA's reaction. The older officer, still studying the documents and the lake, finally looked up. This could be worth millions," he said slowly, almost in disbelief. He glanced at Grandpa, then at the HOA men, who were frozen mid-gesture, mouths open, as if the words themselves were physically hitting them. I could see the realization spread across their faces like wildfire. Grandpa chuckled softly. "You see, a lake is more than just water and fish," he said. "It's about rights, ownership, and history, something you cannot just enforce by waving a clipboard around." His tone was gentle but cutting, and I could see the president's face turning an even deeper shade of red. The younger officer smirked, shaking his head. He had clearly seen enough of this kind of arrogance to know when to let reality handle itself. I leaned back slightly, sipping my coffee, my eyes glued to the scene. The HOA men were trying to argue, flailing in confusion, but every word fell flat. The law, ownership, and common sense were stacked against them, and Grandpa was calm, collected, and completely untouchable. It was almost poetic, watching them scramble while he simply continued fishing. Grandpa's line jerked suddenly, and he reeled in a sizable fish, holding it up with a triumphant grin. "See," he said, "the lake gives rewards to those who understand it, not those who try to control it." The HOA men didn't laugh. They couldn't. They were staring at the water, at the documents, at the reality that they had just lost control of something worth far more than they had ever imagined. I felt a rush of satisfaction. This wasn't just a morning fishing trip anymore. This was a lesson, delivered with humor, calm, and a quiet authority that no rulebook could match. The HOA had called the cops thinking they were enforcing the rules, and in a matter of minutes, they had been shown exactly who really held power. Grandpa leaned back in his boat, smiling faintly, watching the men panic. 3 minutes, he said softly, more to me than anyone else, is all it takes to change everything. I nodded, realizing he was right. In just 3 minutes, the tide had turned, the HOA had lost more than credibility, and the lake had revealed its secrets. The morning had started peacefully, but it was about to end with lessons learned, egos shattered, and a story that would be remembered for a long time. The look on the HOA men's faces was priceless. It was that perfect combination of shock, horror, and disbelief that comes from realizing you've spent years asserting power over something that doesn't belong to you, and that in 3 minutes, it had all blown up in your face. My grandpa, still in his boat, looked calm, collected, and annoyingly satisfied, as though he had been expecting this all along. The president's face was red enough to be mistaken for a warning flag. He shuffled his papers, muttering about rules, guidelines, and community integrity, but every word fell flat against the legal reality staring him in the face. The officers watched silently, arms crossed, as the HOA tried to salvage some shred of dignity. It was like watching toddlers attempt to explain quantum physics. I couldn't stop smiling behind my coffee cup. Grandpa's line jerked suddenly, and he reeled in another fish, holding it up like a trophy. "See," he said, smiling faintly. "The lake rewards patience, not panic." The HOA men flinched, perhaps wondering if the lake had chosen to mock them personally. I laughed quietly, because in that moment the absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming. These men had called the cops over fishing, only to discover that everything they thought they controlled belonged to someone else entirely. One of the HOA men finally blurted out, "But we're protecting the community. This is about safety, order." The younger officer cut him off sharply. "Sir, you've created unnecessary chaos. This property is privately owned. Any further attempt to enforce your rules here could result in legal action against you." The older officer nodded behind him, giving a quiet, knowing glance at Grandpa, who simply tipped his hat in acknowledgement. The president's jaw dropped. "Legal action? Against us?" he whispered to his companion, who looked equally terrified. They had underestimated my grandpa, the property rights, and the law itself. The magnitude of their mistake was sinking in slowly, painfully, and the longer it took, the more comical it became from my vantage point. Grandpa leaned back in his boat, humming softly to himself, completely unbothered by the chaos on the shore. He casually cast his line again, glancing at me. "Watch," he said quietly, "the best part is coming." I squinted, my curiosity piqued. I had no idea what he meant, but knowing him, it was going to be brilliant. And then it happened. The younger officer, still reviewing the documents, looked up and said in a quiet but firm voice, "This lake, the land beneath it, and the water rights, they're worth over $2 million. I nearly dropped my coffee. The HOA men froze mid-breath. Their eyes widened as the reality hit them. They hadn't just called the cops over fishing. They had publicly embarrassed themselves, misstepped legally, and trespassed on property that could financially cripple them if mishandled. The absurdity of the morning had reached a peak I didn't think possible. Grandpa smiled faintly, leaning slightly over the side of the boat. "That's right," he said softly. 3 minutes, that's all it took. Your threats, your rules, your arrogance, they don't hold a candle to patience, knowledge, and a little respect for reality." The HOA men were muttering now, trying to regroup, trying to find a way out of the mess. One of them looked at the officers pleadingly. "Surely there's some compromise," he said. The younger officer shook his head. "The compromise is simple," he said. "You stop harassing the owner, leave the property immediately, and perhaps review your own understanding of the law. That's it." Grandpa reeled in one last fish, placing it gently in the boat. "Gentlemen," he said, calm as the morning sun, "I think it's time for you to go. The lake is peaceful and it's not interested in disputes." The HOA president turned beet red, grabbed his papers, and practically ran back to the patrol car. His companion followed in stunned silence, muttering about rules and fairness, neither of which mattered anymore. I couldn't help but grin as I watched them leave. My grandpa had not only defended the lake, he had turned what could have been a minor annoyance into a complete and total victory. He had done it without raising his voice, without threatening anyone, and without breaking a single law. He had simply let reality speak for itself, and the HOA had no choice but to listen. As the morning sun continued to rise over the water, I leaned back, feeling a rush of satisfaction. The officers chuckled quietly, shaking their heads as they returned to their patrol car. My grandpa adjusted his hat one final time, looked at me with a knowing smile, and said, "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful." I took a deep breath, watching him cast his line into the sparkling lake, feeling a sense of awe and pride. The HOA had learned a lesson in humility, patience had triumphed over arrogance, and the lake had remained, as always, calm, beautiful, and untouchable by fools. In that moment, I realized that mornings like this didn't just happen, they were earned. And as I sipped my coffee, I knew one thing for certain. The story of this morning, of the lake, and of my grandpa's quiet genius would be remembered for a long, long time. After the HOA men finally retreated, muttering to each other and dragging their pride behind them like a wet blanket, a calm settled over the lake. The patrol cars drove away, their lights fading into the morning mist, leaving only the gentle ripple of water and the soft birdsong. I let out a long breath, still holding my coffee, watching my grandpa in his little wooden boat. He looked completely unbothered, like the chaos of the morning had been nothing more than a small distraction before breakfast. He caught another fish, this one bigger than the last, and gently placed it in the boat. "Well," he said, glancing at me with that familiar twinkle in his eye, "that was certainly an interesting morning." I laughed quietly because that understatement was classic grandpa, calm, understated, and impossible to rattle. I stepped closer to the water's edge, trying to process everything that had happened. 3 minutes. That was all it had taken for the HOA to realize they had no authority, for the police to confirm the legal reality, and for the lake and my grandpa to assert their quiet dominance. It was almost poetic. I had expected a tense morning, maybe a little confrontation. Instead, I had witnessed a total and complete reversal of power, executed with grace, humor, and patience. Grandpa leaned back, letting the fishing rod rest against the side of the boat, and said softly, "You know, people often mistake confidence for arrogance. But really it's just preparation, knowledge, understanding who and what you are dealing with." I nodded, still trying to absorb the sheer audacity of the morning. The HOA had called the cops thinking they had control, only to discover that everything they thought mattered had been under someone else's authority all along. I smiled at him, shaking my head. "Grandpa, you were calm the whole time. They were panicking, waving clipboards, calling the cops, and you just fished." He chuckled softly. "Sometimes the best response to chaos is patience. Other times it's letting the universe, or a lake, teach a lesson for you." The water shimmered in the sunlight, and I felt a wave of gratitude. This lake wasn't just property. It was history, it was legacy, it was proof that careful preparation and calm resolve could triumph over ego and bureaucracy. I glanced at the shoreline where the HOA had stood, now empty, and I knew they would be talking about this for years, probably exaggerating every moment to make themselves seem less foolish. Grandpa caught another fish, smaller this time, and handed it to me. "Here," he said. "Sometimes you need a reminder that life rewards calm, not panic. And yes, sometimes it rewards those who wait long enough to see the truth." I laughed, feeling the tension of the morning dissolve. It had been dramatic, absurd, humorous, and deeply satisfying all at once. We sat there in silence for a few moments, just the two of us and the gentle lap of water against the boat. I realized how rare mornings like this were. Chaotic, tense, and absurdly funny, yes, but also profound. It was a reminder that authority isn't about uniforms, clipboards, or loud voices. It's about knowledge, patience, and knowing the full scope of the situation before you act. And then, as the sun climbed higher, casting a golden glow across the lake, Grandpa smiled faintly and said, "Remember this, kid. Sometimes the world will try to rush you, intimidate you, and make you doubt yourself. Don't. Stay calm, know your rights, and let the truth do the rest." I nodded, feeling a sense of awe and respect. The HOA had tried to assert control, called the cops, and ended up humiliated. The lake had remained untouched, calm, and utterly indifferent to their panic. And Grandpa, ever patient, ever prepared, had turned a morning fishing trip into a lesson in humility, legality, and quiet triumph. As we packed up the boat, I looked back at the water one last time. The lake shimmered like it had all along, calm and untouchable, a witness to everything that had happened. I knew this story would be told for years, of the morning the HOA called the cops on Grandpa for fishing, only to discover the full scope of what they had underestimated. It was absurd, dramatic, humorous, and ultimately satisfying. A story that perfectly captured the irony of ego versus patience, chaos versus calm. Grandpa tipped his hat, gave me a wink, and said, "Let's go home, kid. The fish will keep, and the story is ours to tell." I laughed, shaking my head, thinking about how such a peaceful morning had turned into one of the most unforgettable days of my life. And as we walked back toward the house, I knew one thing for sure. The HOA would never forget this lake, this morning, or the quiet man who had outsmarted them all. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.